Hello everybody! Welcome to Rusty Chains. My name is John, and if you're new here, I like fighting games and I like Marvel. So it makes sense that I do a little video about one of the worst kept secrets in the fighting game community right now. If the many leaks are to be believed, NetherRealm Studios is making a Marvel fighting game. Obviously, this leads to a lot of questions, so let's break down the big ones one by one. Is this actually happening? There have been a decent few leaks over the past few months to indicate it, like I said. The first instance of it came from Daniel Richtman, also known as Daniel RPK. After some research, his credibility is somewhat mixed. He's gotten some of his news wrong in the past, but enough correct that he shouldn't be disregarded. The most notable thing he's gotten correct is the trailer release date for Avengers Endgame, but he had the title incorrect, so take that how you will. However, upon doing some digging, there have been some breadcrumbs about this for a little while. Most notably, during a press interview for MK11 in 2019, NRS head Ed Boon outright mentioned that he had discussions with Marvel in the past.
Ever had one conversation with Marvel about making a fighting game?
Yes.
What? When?
I did, but I probably shouldn't talk about it.
Are you excited about that idea?
Oh God, yes. We would love to make like a Marvel fighting game or Marvel versus DC. I think would be the coolest.
Now this next bit requires a bit of knowledge about how NetherRealm Studios works. NRS typically release a new fighting game every other year, announcing it at the end of an even-numbered year and releasing in April or May of odd-numbered years, which gives them a 2-year development cycle. We're actually in a bit of an anomaly now, as there's no currently announced NRS game, and we're in late May of an odd-numbered year. Let's assume that either COVID or the ongoing sale of WB games has delayed things for this game. But last year, there were a few posts about an NRS Marvel game that flew under the radar. Given NetherRealm's usual release windows, this would be when development was the decent way along for these games, so it could be entirely possible for this info to leak. Interestingly, one leak contains a full plot and roster. I want to take a look at that one in particular first. This one starts with a very important bit of context, though it is unconfirmed. This supposedly comes from Art Jedi 134. He's legit, and he did accurately leak a lot of information for Mortal Kombat 11 months before it came out. However, like I said, it's unconfirmed that it did actually come from him. With that in mind, let's look at some of the more plausible elements of the leak. The title is Marvel Age of Infinity. Not too interesting, but makes some sense based on the prominence of the Infinity Stones following the MCU. The plot would revolve around Dr. Doom collecting the Infinity Stones and accidentally making a second universe with evil or dead mirrors of all the main heroes. That right there might be the most believable part of this entire thing. NRS absolutely loves stories about evil clones or evil incarnations of popular heroes. That's a major plot thread throughout the last 3 Mortal Kombat games and is the main story of both Injustice games, all of which were obviously made by NRS. Now let's take a look at this supposed roster. I'm judging how likely each pick is based on MCU relevance, since that decides a lot of Marvel's moves. I'm also looking at general popularity of the characters and some other factors that we'll talk about as well if they pop up. Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Black Widow, Hulk, Scarlet Witch, Spider-Man, and Captain Marvel are all great. They make plenty of sense given their popularity following the MCU. Loki also makes sense as a pick, but I think it's unlikely that they decided on the pre-order bonus that long ago. Zemo, Daredevil, and Bullseye also all make sense, as they're in the MCU and are quite popular in their own right as well. However, I was a little bit skeptical since Daredevil and Bullseye are in the Netflix corner of the universe and haven't jumped over to the main group yet. No Way Home rumors notwithstanding, of course. Dr. Doom being the big villain is pretty understandable, as he's probably the biggest threat of the Marvel universe if they want to avoid using Thanos again after all the movies and Marvel vs. Capcom games have relied on him lately. Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman being here is a really interesting choice. The Fantastic Four MCU movie is still a few years off, but I could see them starting to reintroduce the team to general audiences following the comic purge in mid-2015. However, the head-scratcher for me is the absence of the Human Torch and the Thing. Having half of the Fantastic Four just missing feels off to me, and the notion that the other half could be DLC is even weirder. Wolverine, Storm, Cyclops, and Magneto, all welcome inclusions, feel pretty unlikely since Marvel said that mutants won't be joining the MCU for a while. On top of that, Storm is not in the current iteration of the team, and Magneto's not appearing in the comics right now either. Venom, Doc Ock, Green Goblin, and Kraven the Hunter is where I begin to think the roster segment of this leak is false, as having 4 villains from one hero in a game seems like a bit of overkill. The rest of the heroes have 1 or 2 villains each, if any. Lady Deathstrike, Madeline Pryor, Amara the Enchantress, and Madame Mask are where I basically accepted this roster as fake. These are very obscure characters that very few people have heard of, and all absent from the MCU until Madame Mask shows up next year. Looking over it again, I also noticed a pretty big omission from the roster. There's no Hawkeye. Given that he was part of the 6 core MCU Avengers, it's absolutely wild that Clint Barton is sitting out. Alternatively, there's no Kate Bishop, who is about to take over for him in the MCU. Of course, if I'm wrong and this is the real roster, I'll eat crow and admit my mistake. Also, if Daredevil's in the game, he's mine. Y'all can play whoever you want, except him. Matt is mine. Now here's something that's kind of bonkers. While I was recording that last segment, there was a new leak about the game. Supposedly, this game is actually X-Men vs. Avengers, with more MCU heroes like Ms. Marvel and Shang-Chi, and less heroes from Marvel vs. Capcom. I believe this a heck of a lot more than the roster above. Speaking of Marvel vs. Capcom, we have another question to ask. How did this game come to be? Why in the 9 realms would Marvel turn away from the fan-favorite Marvel vs. Capcom series and commission a fighting game from NRS instead? To answer that, let's crack open the big book of fighting game history and look at the most recent Marvel vs. Capcom game, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. MVCI released in September of 2017 to mixed reception. However, all things considered, it's a miracle the reception was not just a disaster. Infinite was the perfect storm of bad circumstances. Public perception was against the game from the beginning. Reportedly, Infinite was developed on a shoestring budget, to the point where the entire base game and DLC pass had a smaller budget than a single set of Street Fighter DLC. As a result of this, art was the main thing on the chopping block. The bold shading and character outlines of Marvel vs. Capcom 3 were left behind as a less unified art style came in. Poor facial modeling and roughly reused character models were immediately noticed when the story demo was released. The lack of multiplayer in the demo also kept it feeling limited and stale. Despite the fact that on release, the gameplay was considered the only thing Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite did well, before launch there was much skepticism about the change from the series' signature 3 vs. 3 gameplay to 2 vs. 2 in favor of adding the new Infinity Stone mechanic. The problems with perception were not ending there, however. In fact, they were actually just getting started. Despite a large amount of characters being recycled from the Marvel vs. Capcom 3 roster, there were some pretty significant absences as well. Primarily, the Fantastic Four and the X-Men were wiped from the roster. A reason for this has never been officially confirmed, but it can be reasonably assumed. See, Marvel vs. Capcom released a few years before Disney bought out Fox. At the time, the mouse was canceling as much media for the 2 superhero teams as they could in an effort to lower the value of the brand. Their aim was that by making sure nobody cared about the Fantastic Four or the X-Men, Fox would be more willing to sell the film rights back. Of course, most of the movies Fox made helped lower the brand values more than anything else, but that's a whole other story. With these heroes gone, the only people on the Marvel side were heroes and villains that had been represented thus far in the MCU. And also Nova. Considering the Marvel vs. Capcom series originated as X-Men vs. Capcom, their absence in particular was a painful omission that many fans never quite got over. To try to assuage their fears, Capcom said that many of those characters were still represented if characters were considered to be functions rather than, characters. Their example was that Magneto could air dash in the previous games, and even though he's gone, other characters can air dash in Infinite, so it's basically the same. Capcom really couldn't have said anything else, because one of the big rules of business is to not point fingers at your business partner, but silence would possibly have been better. Instead, Capcom came off as tone-deaf to the fact that people want to play as iconic characters like Wolverine because he's the goddamn Wolverine. As if Marvel, likely being the ones to put Capcom in that situation, wasn't bad enough, they also reportedly put a mandate on Capcom that the marketing for the game could show no Marvel heroes losing to Capcom characters in trailers. Since Marvel and Capcom had to go head-to-head in the trailer for Marvel vs. Capcom, that meant Marvel won a lot and the Capcom cast appeared weaker from an outside view. So despite the game ending up pretty fun to play, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite was regarded as visually unappealing and missing a lot of the heart of the franchise. When it came time to tally the numbers, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite sold 1 million copies in December of 2017, 3 months into its 5-month support lifespan. That million copies was less than half of Capcom's target and Marvel's expectations for the launch window alone. That was also significantly less than the amount of units moved by Marvel vs. Capcom 3 a few years earlier. With that in mind, MVCI was regarded as a financial failure, a concept very foreign to Disney and especially Marvel since that one thing in 2008. That black eye for the entertainment giant is something they will not soon forget, and is almost certainly a contributing factor in their move from Capcom to NetherRealm. Many people disregarded the notion of an NRS Marvel game as fake because NRS is a division of Warner Bros. Games, and WB is a competitor to Disney. However, WB and Disney have worked together in the past. Marvel and DC have done multiple crossover comics, and even today WB sometimes publishes video games for Disney. On top of that, if Disney wanted to make sure the game is a financial win, NRS is a good bet. Their last game sold 8 million copies in just under 2 years, which is, in professional terms, fucking gangbusters. So how would the game play? Obviously, this is the biggest question surrounding the game. The first thing to do is understand the core gameplay we'll get from a NetherRealm Studios game. Their last 2 games, Injustice 2 and Mortal Kombat 11, are ones I often recommend to people new to the fighting game genre. Although there is plenty of interesting tech to be found and learned in both games, they are a bit more simple than most of the genre as a whole. All of these games use gear systems, where you can unlock equipment for characters. In Injustice 2, they modify stats. In MK11, however, gear is entirely cosmetic, and you can instead slot in augments to modify the stats of your look. In addition to that, Mortal Kombat, X, and 11 use the variation system. In those games, there's too many special moves to use at once, so you make your own variations of characters, each with their own special, but their normal moves and combo strings remain the same. MK11 in particular is very slow and an easy game to get into. One of the main criticisms of it is that it doesn't have the giant full-screen supers or super ridiculous combos that you'd see in games like Guilty Gear, Marvel vs. Capcom, or King of Fighters. Keeping in mind from the last leak I showed that this game is supposedly using an updated version of the Injustice 2 engine, we have to look at the major criticisms of that game. It was chock full of projectile and long-range attacks. In addition to those, the game also had more infinite loop combos than many other fighters. An infinite loop combo, as the name implies, is a very long and intricate combo that your opponent can escape. If you can pull it off, it's a free win. Very fun and rewarding to perform, but infuriating to play against. That, along with all those projectiles, made Injustice 2 somewhat divisive among fans of the genre later in its lifespan. However, the gold standard for NRS games is always their presentation. Mortal Kombat 11 in particular was regarded as one of the best looking fighting games ever until Guilty Gear Strive showed up. In short, if this game is real, we can expect a very good looking fighter with a low skill floor that allows anybody to play, but it might have a lower skill ceiling as a result. That about covers it. This video ended up being a lot longer than ones I usually make, but I got to really get into talking about games and comic stuff, which are some of my favorite things, so, I had a lot to say. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this longer style of video, what your thoughts are on the possibility of a NetherRealm Marvel fighter, and maybe, share the video around a bit. Thanks for watching. Until next time, don't forget to spread the happy and stay rusty.